Hey everybody, it's your friend. I don't know. Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I put on a tie today, as you know, Paul. It might have got in there, it might not have been in there, but Paul just mentioned that I'm wearing a tie. I always like to look nicer than the person that I'm debating. So like, this isn't actually a debate. This is going to be a completely chill stream. But Paul and I have been going round and round. I've somewhat accused him of straw manning. He made a video. My name came up in that video. I think I quit counting at about 55 times. So,
I just love you, Adam. I can't stop talking about you.
So, but this is this is all in good fun. Paul and I are very good friends, and we figured we would just sit down and watch this video together. I'm looking at it from a very different perspective than Paul. I'm very interested in Paul's perspective. Paul seems interested in mine. I'm very much a rationalist materialist. One of the reasons why I got into Jordan Peterson, because Jordan Peterson was articulating an argument in favor of religion that is a very materialist argument based on scientific studies and whatnot. And I don't know that I would be equipped to understand or enjoy Jordan Peterson as much as I was if I hadn't read so much of the evolutionary psychology, Jonathan Haidt. We had talked about Joseph Henrich before we started the stream. Like, I've read so much of this stuff that Jordan Peterson just so comfortably fits with that it's just seemed natural what he was saying. But as I've gone on, and Paul and I have talked about this a little bit before the stream, that, you know, we're in this as kind of a learning experience. So my audience, I'm kind of unfamiliar with. I did a poll. I don't know if you know this, Paul, but 50% of my audience is Christian. Like, I'm under the impression that a lot of them don't even know that I'm an atheist. On the poll, I said, how many of you are Christian atheists? A lot of people, well, some people, not a lot of people, but some people seemed offended by this. I think of myself as a Christian atheist. So I'm kind of feeling out my audience as I go. A lot of people like Jordan Peterson for very different reasons than me. And you and I think, really bonded in our early relationship over, you know, what is this Jordan Peterson guy? Like, why is he such a big deal? So, and Jordan Peterson definitely ties into the conversation, the video that we're going to watch here with Bret Weinstein. Bret Weinstein was involved in one of the first. Well, I think he was the first two nights where Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris debated. And Jordan Peterson, just to give the people who don't know the backstory, Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris did a podcast together that was very contentious. And Jordan Peterson was a nobody then. Sam Harris was much larger than Jordan Peterson, and Sam Harris just took him to task. And I was really on Sam Harris's side in that podcast. What were your feelings in that podcast, Paul?
I think they were talking past each other quite a bit. I really have to go back and re-listen to that podcast. A lot of people have told me that it was very important. I've only listened to it once or twice, and usually before I treat something, I listen to it quite a bit more often than that.
Yeah, I went through that podcast many times because Jordan Peterson sounded insane to me. But everything he said made perfect sense. I was like, why are my intuitions just shooting off that this guy's just spewing BS? But at the same time, I can't really argue against anything that he's saying. So I kind of deconstructed that. They did a second podcast, which I didn't like Jordan Peterson at all in, because it felt like Sam Harris was just like, Jordan Peterson was blowing up, and it felt like Sam Harris was like, okay, just let Grandpa talk. Like, there wasn't really a lot of, like, Jordan Peterson wasn't really pushing a lot of boundaries in that one. And I consider myself a rebel, so I didn't like that. Do you have any thoughts on the second one?
I thought the second one was a little clearer. I did appreciate the Pang Burn talks, the four of them that they did, the first two with Bret, and then the last two. I don't think they got a lot done, but I think it actually gave Peterson a chance to lay out a lot of his stuff. And Sam, I think, just basically didn't want to play. But I thought Bret Weinstein was helpful in those as well.
Yeah, very much so. And that's why I wanted to bring it up, was because Bret and Jordan Peterson were communicating. Like, they were having an honest conversation about a lot of the things that we're going to talk about in this live stream, about religion and evolution and how these two things interface. And Sam Harris was just not playing ball, which seems ironic to me, because Sam Harris is the one that keeps saying, I want a religion that I don't have to believe any BS. And it seems like Jordan Peterson is quietly articulating that religion for a lot of people like me who are Christian atheists, who I must admit, for when you come to the world with a materialist worldview, you don't like when people break that frame. And Jordan Peterson never breaks that frame. I think a lot of anti-theists, and I make the distinction between anti-theists and atheists. Atheists don't believe in God. Anti-theists believe in a very religious way that the world would be a better place without religion. So they see religion as a failed science standing in the way of our own progress. This is a narrative that I don't believe in. And Jordan Peterson seems to be articulating that better than anyone, but he never dips into the woo. If you go to Jordan Peterson with this idea that he is bad or a religious apologist or a Christian apologist, you kind of superimpose that idea onto him. And you don't really listen to what he's saying, because what he's saying is very complex stuff. I mean, the evolutionary science is very complex. The stuff Bret Weinstein talks about here is very complex stuff. So I think it's very easy for them to dismiss it as, this is religious woo, religious nonsense. This is Deepak Chopra level stuff. Do you have an opinion on Deepak Chopra?
I don't watch him.
Okay.
I don't watch him at all.
Yeah.
I don't know what he has to say. I probably wouldn't have a lot of respect for him.
So Deepak Chopra, and they're like night and day. I'm like, open your eyes. Jordan Peterson is a scientist. Like, he keeps citing, he brings up E.O. Wilson in the first talk and talks about consilience. If you don't know this stuff, it sounds like woo, but that's the holy grail of uniting biology and ethics. Dude, that's two huge fields of study. So it's fascinating to me. So I've rambled on here for a long time. I want to give you a chance to talk about this discussion and what your take on it was.
Well, I was very much looking forward to this discussion between Alister McGrath and Bret. I've followed some of Alister McGrath's work. I've read a number of his books over the years. He has a terrific biography of someone I won't name, because when I name him, Adam gets upset. And
no, you have to name him now, because people in the chat want to know who you're talking about. I believe it's Mr. Lewis.
Mr. Lewis. But so Alister began his first degree was in, I think it was in biochemistry, which they laid out here. I was actually a little bit disappointed in this discussion, because I don't think Alister had any idea who he was sitting down with. And so often the pairings tend to be between anti-theists and someone like Alister McGrath. And so when Bret comes along basically with an evolutionary justification for religion, and Bret, I think, understands how religion has been useful in terms of the evolution of the species. Alister, I think, was very interested in what he had to say, but really didn't come alive at the end when Alister did notice, as we'll get to, that in many ways, Bret, like many others, is looking to find something that has the capacitive power of religion to define and bring communities together, but doesn't have any supernatural elements that offend naturalists.
Right.
And so then we'll talk about that as we get into this video.
So you made a response video to this video as well, and I just want to bring up, it seemed to me, and this may be the wrong reading, but it seemed that you're a little offended, and I don't know if offended is the right word. You're a little skeptical, let's say that, of the idea that we can create a religion. And I think that you're maybe saying that you're thinking that Bret is proposing a brand new religion from whole cloth, and I'm not sure that that's what he's proposing.
Oh, I don't think he is either.
Okay.
I think what my understanding of what he says at the end of this video is, we need something. So when I understand your definition of what a religion is, it very much follows Durkheim and Jonathan Haidt in terms of what religions do. I understand Bret is saying we need a new religion where we're not going to continue to participate in this conflictive genetic spelling bee that has threatened humanity for years, but we probably don't have enough time to do it, so we're probably going to die. That's how I understand his conclusion to this video. And from his point of view, I very much understand that, because armed with nuclear weapons, ecological devastation that we're seeing, I talked to somebody on my channel who just basically says humanity simply consumes too many resources that at some point we're not going to be able to sustain life on this planet, and we're going to have a hard crash at some time in the future, which may happen. Others say no, like Steven Pinker or perhaps Jordan Peterson. No, we should be optimistic. We've always found our way out of problems before. We'll find our way out of these crises too.
Yeah. And you're skeptical of whether or not Bret's project is even feasible. I mean, I feel the same way for a lot of reasons.
I don't think, Jordan Peterson often says, you can't just sit down and write a fairy tale. Now, the point he's making isn't that you can't sit down and write something that maybe in 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,000 years won't be regarded as that, but that you won't even live long enough to know if you've made a contribution. Because many of the things that religions are these highly complex systems of thought that have evolved over very long periods of time and have been molded and shaped. And this is part of the reason I was excited about Alister McGrath, because one of my favorite book of his is actually a book named Heresy, where he, in a sense, charts out an evolutionary description of how Christian orthodoxy and heresy developed over hundreds of periods during the time of the early church. And because I think Jordan Peterson makes the strong assertion that ideas like organisms in the wild live and die based on their value within cultures and contexts. And part of what makes religion so potent and so difficult to just come up with a new one is that these ideas have been tested over very long periods of time, over a huge diversity of contexts, which affords them durability. And Bret recognizes that, and which is part of what I think leads to a skepticism. Now, he says we need to create wisdom, and I agree with that. John Vervaeke, another guy I've been doing videos about, makes the same point. The difficulty with wisdom is that it takes hundreds of years to know whether something is wise or not, because what happens is societies try things and they wind up being dead ends, and so they discard it. And this is, religions are, and I think you would agree with this, are the accumulation of all of those years of basically trial and error, and that process continues. And I'll actually, later in this video, when he talks about what we need to do with this received wisdom that we find in religious texts, actually religious communities are always about the work of doing that, but they do it in an embedded way where they actually live within the religion. It would be similar to, let's say, if you wanted to discuss the morality of Harry Potter, you and your friends could sit down over a couple of beers and just shoot the breeze about whether Hermione should have hooked up with Harry or whatever.
That's what I wonder whenever I have this conversation.
But you would get quite a bit further if, in a sense, you actually attempted to embody and live within that world and act out the parts. And so, in a sense, what Bret sort of wants to do is he recognizes this process of religion, but he kind of wants to sit on the sidelines and decide, who he should, who Harry should hook up with. When in fact, what religious communities do is from the inside and are always working out these conversations of wisdom. And over time, well, you find out which ideas succeed and which ideas don't.
He does at the very end talk about how he's trying to forge new traditions with his kids. So there is some of that embodied living it that he's trying. But I completely agree with you. Until you're doing it in like at one family level, it's not going to make any kind of impact whatsoever. Like, then it's just a family tradition. It's not necessarily like the whole thing is to get multiple families to buy in, and that's the magic. That's why I keep saying when the anti-theists talk about getting rid of Christianity, I'm like, like, how do you get multiple families to buy in on any traditional wisdom? Like these families are teaching this wisdom to their children without communicating with one another. That is, in some sense, magic. So
yeah.
So I have this, before we get in, I had clipped out a short bit of the video. There's one cut in here. I cleaned up the audio a little bit just because I have a hard out. We're not going to go more than an hour and a half. Did you want to mention something? You made a point before we started the stream on the full talk that there's something that's not actually in this clip that you wanted to reference.
Well, part of what came out of the Peterson, Harris, Weinstein conversation was this idea of metaphorical truth. Now, I don't necessarily like Bret's formulation of it. I think Jonathan Pageau makes the point quite strongly that in many ways, all of our articulations and representations of truth are really metaphorical in a deep way. It's simply the nature of language. And so he talks about a community that mostly lived on boats that was in Indonesia that
I hate to interrupt you, Paul, but maybe lay out the metaphorical truth versus literal truth just so people know where you're going with the story.
Well, yeah. Well, the metaphorical truth is a story that we might not believe. Actually, just today, Jonathan Pageau did a video that basically said there's no such thing as literal.
Right. It's an interesting philosophical argument.
Yeah. So basically, a group has a story that improves their ability to survive that might not be considered literally true.
Okay, and that's what metaphorical truth is.
Right. And so in the conversations with Peterson and Harris, they use the example of when you, for example, if you're properly trained to use firearms, you always check whether or not the gun is loaded, even though you just remember not loading the gun or even have opened it before. You're a little obsessive compulsive about whether or not a gun is actually loaded. And they also talked about the idea that porcupines shoot their quills. Now, apparently porcupines don't shoot their quills, but the story being told to children keeps them a good distance away from the porcupine, and therefore they don't endanger themselves. So it might not be literally true that porcupines shoot their quills, but a community that embraces the story has an adaptive advantage over another community, theoretically, because of a metaphorical story.
Right. So, and
That's
in
the
this,
idea.
he used another example. I cut you off before you got to the example, but you wanted to say in this talk, he uses this example of, I think it was a tsunami or something.
Right. So he makes the point that there was a tribe in Indonesia that had a belief that the spirit that lives in the ocean, before that spirit, when that spirit got angry, the waters would recede. And when that happens, the spirit is angry and you should leave your boats and everything and run up to the hills. No lives were lost in that community when the tsunami hit, whereas many other people it's Indonesia, so you probably have Muslims, Christians, whoever, they all ran out into the water to where the water had been to see the flapping fish. And then the tsunami comes in and a great number of lives were lost. And so he used that example of the metaphorical truth of the spirit being in the water was, in that sense, adaptively superior than the literal truth that waters have no spirit. Now, I think the story is problematic in many respects. It's also interesting. What it does show, I think he intends it to show, that ancient religious traditions bear wisdom in them that are profitable even for contemporary contexts. And he's going to kind of double back and forth over that line a number of times in this conversation. And so as we listen to it, we'll notice that.
And what was your problem with that? Why
Well,
this description? I noticed before we started the stream, you said you seemed to imply that there were spirits in the ocean. And I know my materialist, naturalist perspective just was like, oh, why you got to go there, Paul? Jeez.
well, let's talk about language. Do you believe there's something? Do you believe that there's such a thing as school spirit?
Yes. Yeah, I do.
Okay. Where is school spirit located?
In the minds of the students.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does school spirit get expressed in immaterial physical aspects of school?
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
Yeah. And it can, in fact, be communicated by immaterial things and picked up by others. You might walk into a school that you've never been to. You walk into the school and you say, this building has a certain feel to it.
Mm-hmm.
And you pick up, in a sense, the spirit of the school,
right,
when you walk in. And the difficulty that we have when we're talking about religious traditions that have been developed over very long periods of time is that this iron line that we draw between human agents and what we consider dead matter, they didn't have that line. And so their language and tradition and ways they talked basically expressed both of that. Now, what's very interesting is that atheists died in that tsunami, and everyone from this tiny little religious tradition lived. And this is the heart of Bret's point. But the language that he used to kind of dismiss the idea of angry spirits in the waters, that's actually not a bad thing to teach your children if you're a community that lives on a boat by the sea, which both bears Bret's point, but as we watch the video, you're going to notice means, maybe these traditions have some value that continues to play out in our contexts today. Because part of what has happened in the modern world, especially since we've sort of disenchanted the world, is that we've imagined, well, we're so smart, we know that there are no spirits in the waters. Well, how would you know that there are or aren't? This is just a frame of reference that scientifically you have no data on. And I think you're better off admitting your agnostic position with respect to movement in the waves and what spirits may inhabit schoolyards or churchyards or waters than just simply dismissing there's no spirit in the water.
I feel it's funny. I hate being cast in the role of Sam Harris, but I feel I feel a little Sam Harris creeping up in me because I feel like I understand the argument that you're making, that there is this, like, it's basically there's the whole is greater than the sum of its parts argument. And if you add up all the parts and you get a greater number, that greater number is somehow immaterial, right? Because we're adding up all the material parts and we're getting this number. But the interactions between people, the idea of the way they decorate the gymnasium, in their own special way, makes a part of that school spirit. And since we're human beings, we know these things. These are often unconscious things that we can pick up on, these cues, like their status, the way their community organizes itself, their heritage, all these things are these subconscious cues. But we could still take those back to materialist things. And I know Sam Harris would argue that, just because the belief that there were spirits in the water saved a lot of lives, it doesn't actually mean that there were spirits in the water, in the same way that just acting as if a gun is always loaded is going to save lives, but it still doesn't change the facts of whether or not the gun is loaded.
But the fact is, you don't know whether there's a spirit in the gun or the spirit in the waters, because it's simply an aspect that scientific materialism can't talk about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm talking about it. Like,
Okay.
this is one of the reasons.
How would you tell if there's spirit in the water?
Okay, well, you got me there. You totally got me there. But this is, I think, what's interesting about the Bret Weinstein, and we've talked long enough. Let's jump into the clip. Do you have the 11-minute one showing? So
I believe I do.
I switched over to that one. So
okay. So I think if you play it, I'll watch it too.
Yeah, we'll see here.
The thing we have to look at is...
All good on your end?
Yep.
Let's say that this evolutionary perspective is actually right, or substantially right. If it is, we have a new problem, which is that those books are full of wisdom that is not up to date. And what we know, beyond a shadow of any doubt, is that we are playing with tools that are very unlike the tools that the ancestors who refined these texts had at their disposal. And so...
Now it's odd to me because like Bret Weinstein and Jordan Peterson really seem to team up against Sam Harris in those first two talks. But yet Bret Weinstein puts together basically Sam Harris and the anti-theist argument. They're like, okay, religion's dangerous. People are flying planes into buildings and stuff like that. We really have to rein in this religion stuff because, the dangerous technology. So I don't necessarily know. To me, it seems like the religion probably helps against the dangerous technology. I guess Weinstein is really making the argument that our religious traditions are competing against one another in a way that technology is in effect going to be used by one of the religious traditions to snuff out the other. So do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't see most of our conflicts today in the world revolving around separations between, let's say, Christians and Muslims. Most of some of the bloodier tensions are in fact between Hindus and Buddhists, which on the American scene, people are like, oh, Buddhists and Hindus, they don't hurt anyone. Well, in India they do. But it's, part of, at the end of World War II, there was a pretty fervent discussion as to whether or not nationalism could be afforded, because nationalisms basically have the same dynamics as religions. They're stories that bind people together. And for the most part, the nuclear weapons are held by nation states. And most of the times when we have wars in this, at least in the 20th and 21st century, it's done by nation states. And so if you were really looking at, well, there's something that we should abolish in order to make the world a safer place, you might argue that would be nationalism. The difficulty is that we are now so utterly dependent upon nation states for basic services and all kinds of other things that we can't seem to do without the nation state. So
it would eliminating the nation state is tantamount to suicide in our modern world. So,
and I would argue that in many ways, nation states replaced religion in many ways in the world in the in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. People used to not consider themselves French or German. They were Christians, and so then the Christian-Muslim tensions were high, and anti-Semitism was quite high. Mm-hmm. Part of, especially in a place like the United States, this American ethos was supposed to sort of replace and bind Christians and Jews and Muslims and different racial groups together. That was the promise of nationalism, but the bitter pill of nationalism is that for the most part, it's nationalities that hold buttons on nuclear weapons, not religious groups.
Yeah. All right, you're free to pause whenever you want. You've watched some of our Sitch streams. Sitch does 90% of the pausing.
Oh, really?
I just kind of kick back and wait for him to pause because he pauses every 6 seconds. It's like, come on, the guy was making a point.
I get that complaint in a lot of my videos. People are like, well, why don't you let it run? I'm like, well, watch the original. I don't butt into that one.
Exactly.
If you want to watch me butt in, watch this video.
Exactly. This video is about us.
What and I've had this argument with Jordan Peterson too, the problem with recognizing that these are compendiums of some kind of wisdom, well, there are a couple problems. One, some of the wisdom is itself immoral. You know, if you look at the Old Testament and you look at Deuteronomy.
Okay.
I knew it. I was like, I saw trigger. What? My tradition's immoral.
We're gonna have to talk about the morality aspect, because you need what Bret never does is account for his morality.
No.
And this is a pattern I see in Sam Harris, in many modern people, that there's no accounting for their own morality, but it's always assumed. So we're going to get to that at some point. But another point I really wanted to make in this was that I hear again and again anti-theists basically say, well, Christians are locked into a Bronze Age morality and Bronze Age practice. I am with Christians all the time, and I don't watch them acting like the Midianites or the Amorites or the Amalekites or anyone else from the Bronze or Iron Age. Religions are constantly updating themselves. Now, this is a point that I think, in all fairness, we should concede to the atheists. Religious people often aren't acknowledging the updating they're doing, and particular religious groups that have a high value on what they describe as biblical literalism tend to have a lot of denial about the ways that they have changed. And so what religious people usually do is segment a certain part of their lives and say, this is my religious life. And so I'll segment it over here, and I will act like a 21st century American or Canadian or whoever over here. And so it's again and again I hear, well, religious people don't update. It's like my grandmother at the beginning of the 20th century, when she was a little girl going to her church, one day wore flesh-colored stockings to church. And an old man in the church stopped her and said, why aren't you wearing stockings? And my grandmother, the little pipsqueak, she was quite a feisty woman. She said, I'm wearing flesh-colored stockings. And, you know, and so what you have in religious traditions, and you watch it all the time, these communities change. Now you've got some Amish over here, and you've got a few other fringe groups over there. But for the most part, look at the vast majority of religious people in the modern world. They're all changing and updating their practices according to the time, usually with a fair amount of conversation and often tension within and between religious traditions, but it's always changing. And so I really don't know hardly anyone who just lives, this is what the Bible says, so I'm going to bring a goat to church and the pastor's going to sacrifice it. Religious traditions just don't work that way.
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring this up, because I don't like the moral argument for the existence of God. And sometimes I wonder if the moral argument is part of this conflation, because they want to make this argument that morality is universal, you know, beyond space and time and forever, this immutable. And that is part of the denial that religious traditions are updating. Like, the updating mechanism in religion is an asset, not a cost.
Right. The difficulty that religious traditions face, and I think a great current example of that is the question over same-sex marriage, is that what religious traditions are always trying to do is modulate time. So you have more conservative traditions that say, not so sure. And then you have some more adaptive religions that say, we're going to change all of these things right away. Now, actually, that diversity of speed is a feature, not a bug. Now, within the religious traditions, you feel all this tension. But if you take a step back, what you find is that these religious communities are testing new ideas all the time. And groups that perhaps grab an adaptation quickly, maybe they'll benefit from it, maybe they won't. You know, it's a remarkable thing. If you look at a highly non-adaptive tradition like the Amish, folks, you know, travel all over the world, from all over the world, to eat Amish pies and Amish quilts and watch them drive in their buggies. What a brilliant business decision. But, religious traditions are like that because, as Darwinians note, the world is too complex to predict. So what religious people actually do is work out their narrative, live action role playing in many ways, and over time gain wisdom, write down that wisdom, embody it within their tradition. And see, I would argue that the world is actually quite a bit better for it.
Yeah. And just to push back on the anti-theist with a very materialist look at this, I know Paul likes to pull out C.S. Lewis and talk about the spiritual aspect of it, but there's a very great book by Joseph Henrich where he talks about this. There's all kinds of religious wisdom in the world that is there because it worked, but we don't necessarily know scientifically why it works. If we do dive in to figure out why it works scientifically, often we can get answers, but those answers aren't enriching the people's lives that are using it in any way, shape, or form. They're just fine not knowing that stuff. So if anything, we're adding a level of complexity to their lives that is unnecessary.
That's right. And many people will remember the Scopes trial. So the Scopes trial was the famous monkey trial in Tennessee. Now, the conservative Christian who argued that case was William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan argued that case because he saw, the newish Darwinian models as basically being racist, because these models said, well, here you've got, you've got these gorillas, they're dark. And so African people, they're less evolved than European white people. And so you had these eugenics ideas that were very, very common all the way up until the Second World War. And it was actually religious conservative peoples that were arguing against them, which after the Second World War and Hitler was, doing all these things to people sort of backed off eugenics, probably for, a few generations. But I think we're probably going to see these ideas as coming back. But this is why it's actually, in our political system and in our religious system, it's actually a pretty good thing that you've got a diversity of approaches to innovation, because not all innovation is moral or welcome or productive over the very long term, which is actually a point that Bret is making here.
Yeah, very good point. I see your super chats, and I thank you so much for your generosity. I will read super chats at the end if you want to ask questions or anything like that of me or Paul. I'll definitely set aside like 15 minutes at the end that we can go through them. So let's move on.
You'll find rules for war that are absolutely abhorrent, basically advice on genocide. You'll find rules for how to properly keep slaves and things like this. So those are bits of wisdom from the point of view of how to advance your population's interests, but they are not ethical advice in any decent sense of the term. That's one thing.
Okay, so he makes a good point here, which, again, one of the things that happened during the American Civil War was that there was a pretty fierce debate between religious communities in the North and the South about the appropriate stance on slavery. Now, one of the things that many didn't recognize was that the institution of slavery, the slavery itself, had in fact changed markedly from the kinds of slavery that you saw in the ancient Near East and in the Roman period. But today, I can't think of a single religious tradition that promotes slavery. Why did it change? Well, it changes all the time. And most religious people, at least Christians in America, when they read passages like that from the Old Testament, even if they say they're strong literalists, I don't know anyone who claims to be a strong literalist who is advocating for the return of slavery today. None. Which again makes the point that religious people don't just read the Bible and say, oh, there's slaves here, we got to go find some slaves. If they in fact did, they would understand that, well, you gain slaves by conquering the next door village, not by picking people by the color of their skin. So, this this caricature that religious people just read stuff out of the book and kind of go off and do things according to the book. That's not how religious people work.
Yeah, I did a debate recently where, man, the anti-theists love to like talk about slavery. It's slavery this, slavery that. And I just kept saying, let's take 100 random Christians off the street and ask them, is slavery moral or immoral? What do you think those 100 Christians will say? Oh, immoral. Like, so you're admitting that all of them seem to work out that this is ancient history and that it doesn't affect their religious tradition today.
Right.
Yeah,
and if Christians really thought they would practice this, well, then the city of Sacramento would try and beat up on the city of Davis, and we could make them all our slaves. That would be the application of, books of the Bible. Nobody thinks that.
That's too much work.
You got all these college kids over there in Davis, they're young, but the truth is human beings make lousy slaves anyway.
They do. Terrible.
They're way too smart.
But the other thing is, because these texts are products of evolution, they are only relevant to the circumstances in which they evolved. So the fact that
now
I knew it. It's so funny.
Because these texts are products of evolution, I'd love to hear him define that.
Well, you defined it already. In this talk, you talked about the evolutionary argument for the development of the religious wisdom.
Right. The question I have is, what do you mean by evolution in this case? Because, for example, when we're talking about biological Darwinian evolution, we're talking about basically life and death. Now, there is a degree of that going on with thought and ideas, but a lot of it, for example, why did same-sex it's really helpful to remember that in 2012, Hillary Clinton believed in civil unions. When's the last time you ever heard of civil unions for same-sex couples? Now, is it true that same-sex marriage passed because everyone in America that believed in civil unions or was against same-sex marriage died? The human evolution of thought works a little bit differently than what we imagine as biological adaptation or failures to adapt. And I think it's helpful to note that when he says evolution, well, he's using a metaphor. He's using the metaphor of biological death and adaptation to talk about processes of thought.
Yeah, the evolution, though, doesn't necessarily need to involve death as in biological death, because it's reproduction, variation, and selection. And that works just as easily with ideas as it does with biological organisms. But at the same time, if a genetic population dies out, their whatever religious tradition they're using dies out with them, unless it's used by somebody else. But I understand the point that you're making.
Yeah. When religious traditions die, it's seldom because all of its adherents die. It's usually because the ideas have been abandoned and exchanged for new ones.
Better ideas. So the thing is, and this
maybe better, maybe worse.
Well, time will tell, and this is what Jordan Peterson constantly says. It's true enough. We never get to cash that epistemological check until, it never gets cashed, because we could all die tomorrow. So, but the point Bret is making, and I think one of the things that I think the Christian side is strawmanning him a little bit on is, well, I don't know, because he never really articulates it well here, but when we're talking about a new religion in the evolutionary context, evolution uses the things it has at hand. So it would have to be a better form of Christianity in my book. And Justin brilliantly points this out, even in the talk. He says, the advantage of Christianity, it's turn the other cheek. It's let forgive your enemies, let the outsider inside the tribe. And that's a helpful thing. So,
well, I agree completely. It's if you look at almost all of the religions we have today, they're almost all adaptations of other religions.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history and the evolution of religion, Well, you have this ancient Near East culture, Judaism
I
is
think
kind of a weird thing.
variation. I think variation is, be precise in your speech, right? I think variation is probably a better term than adaptation,
Well,
because
but adaptation,
well,
because for example,
the
go ahead.
variation though, because the reason why I'm pushing back on the term adaptation is because adaptation is considered beneficial in biological terms. Variation, as you've said already, like some of these traditions could not be advantageous and could in effect die out. But so all of the religions that we're seeing are variations. Whether or not they survive and become adaptations is a different story. I would argue that Christianity is definitely adaptive. It's a pro biological, pro social religion. But Mormonism is an interesting thing, and I'm just reading a book on Mormonism because they have the polygamy thing, and I think the polygamy is a bad value that can destroy. Well, it's hard to sustain a community that's polygamous because you have all these high status males monopolizing the females. The males don't want to stick around. The ones that do are just will destroy the community from within. So Mormonism has gotten rid of polygamy, but it still kind of persists a little bit. So
Yeah, well, and I think I mean, if adaptation has implicit within it a value judgment, then I'd agree with your variation idea. And your point about polygamy is a good one, and I think it supports Bret's concept that when we achieve other social, I mean, for example, there is really no, if people imagine the Bible is full of rules, first of all, the Bible isn't. Second of all, there are all kinds of moral ideas and suggestions in the Bible. There's really no formal setting aside of polygamy in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And so the movement away from polygamy seemed again to have been a very contextual thing. And there's actually quite a bit of variation in Christian communities about that seems to be connected to many other societal realities.
Right. So I think, and this is relevant to the talk, because Bret Weinstein is in effect making the argument that we can use the scientific method, we can use what we know about evolution to kind of verify if our ethics are sustainable over time. And where you have a difference from different religious sects on polygamy, all the religious tradition has to do is turn to divine revelation, which I don't know how you reconcile two religious groups that both are claiming to have divine revelation, one for polygamy, one against. But if you can look at the empirical data and lay out the argument that I just laid out about low status males and conflict within the community driving the community apart, there's an empirical argument to be made against polygamy that I don't necessarily know that there's a theological argument to make against it.
I would. It is very common. In fact, it is the norm within religious communities to have groups with conflicting positions both claim divine revelation. It cancels itself out in these conversations.
Okay,
and
interesting.
When it sort of gets canceled out, people tend to look to other factors in order to discern what God or the gods might be blessing. That's normal practice within traditional religions. Now, I wouldn't necessarily call that the scientific method, but I would say people are empirically valuing things to determine whether such and such a thing is pleasing to God or the gods. It's done all the time. And I would also use the example of eugenics. I think both of us could say, well, would our society be better if we would select certain traits that now, having a general idea about general intelligence, IQ, all of this, if we, in fact, practiced eugenics to give a given society more brighter students than dumber students. Now, that might become very attractive. Some people are arguing that the Chinese, in fact, are doing it or are going to do it. I think the argument against it would say, we don't know enough. And therefore, the moral position that says we don't allow who will reproduce and not reproduce, or we will kill babies of the stupid and encourage those with high general intelligence scores to multiply. We have moral arguments against it, but I don't know that those moral arguments necessarily square with the science we have about general intelligence. Yet we persist with the moral argument.
Yeah, I don't know, because that is going to become a reality, and I don't necessarily know that it's fair to call it eugenics, because the situation that is actually going to happen, and I've read that this technology is in development. The problem, like, babies in the future are all going to be done via IVF by people who have money, obviously people who can afford this. And they will be able to take skin cells and turn them into zygotes. So you'll be able to select between thousands of embryos. They will test those embryos, and those embryos will be eliminated based on things like IQ, based on things like height. Like, I want my son to be a violin player. So they'll be able to give you a sheet with probabilities on all of this stuff. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how you can make a theological argument against that, because the argument against eugenics is like, we're telling people you can't, these two people need to mate because they're both high IQ, which, obviously that's an authoritarian position. But if people are using this path of their own free volition, it doesn't seem like eugenics anymore to me, but you still have the same kind of outcome.
Yeah, well, and this whole concept we have of human freedom, that people get to choose who to mate with. I mean, that whole idea is based on this idea of human freedom. Now, what if we discover that a society that centrally plans reproduction is producing more Nobel laureates and Ivy League graduates? Does morality then dictate that we no longer allow people the freedom to choose? What I'm saying here is that this morality business is a pretty complicated one, and that in many ways, at least in the West, we've sort of opted for we've sort of assumed we're not going to be overly controlling because we don't know enough. Now, that worked to our advantage when competing economically with the Soviet Union, who wanted to centrally plan their government. But the question will be, at what point does a society think they know enough to no longer allow freedom of desire, let's say? These are hard questions.
Is that the thing that you're worried most about? Because America is such an individualistic society. I mean,
I think what I'm saying is that this business about morality is really complicated. And when Bret just makes, well, we know that slavery is immoral. Okay. I certainly agree with that. And I think almost all Americans agree with that. But, I do my Freddie and Paul show. What if I were to take Freddie into my home and feed him and clothe him, and in exchange for that demand that he cut my grass? Would that be slavery? Well, the only marker would be if Freddie wasn't allowed to leave my home. But what if Freddie realized that, basically he's better off living with me, even if he hates to cut the grass? These are we tend to throw around these ideas pretty flippantly, and morality is a pretty complex conversation.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I love Jonathan Haidt is that it is complex, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we can't understand it in detail. Like I don't agree in central planning, obviously. I don't think any one individual can understand it. But one of the reasons why I brought up the IVF thing is because it's really kind of like a market-based thing. Like it allows individual freedom. And I really think when people are talking about eugenics, they're talking about slavery, central planning. They're talking about these authoritarian. They're talking about somebody else making the decisions for you. And I don't necessarily know. I mean, we bring our children. How is it any different? If you're bringing your children into the world, you're pretty much making that decision for them. I don't know how, making the decision, it almost becomes immoral to make the decision that you're going to bring. Like if you can choose between a high IQ person and a low IQ person, and you choose to bring the low IQ person into the world, is that not the immoral decision? Like you're taking away an advantage that they could have?
Well, people with very high IQs tend to also be fairly neurotic and less happy than people with low IQs. So you're going to bring a high IQ unhappy person or a low IQ happy person. I mean, this is part of the reason it's so complicated.
Yes.
That at what point do we say we know enough now to decide our destinies? And this is the morality that we have.
Right.
I think these are going to be questions that I think in the next 30 years are really going to stretch our assumptions about morality.
Well, there's no way we can get through this video. We're like we're coming up on an hour here. We're only a minute in. Let's try to let Bret get a couple arguments out before we.
Okay.
The Bible provides no guidance whatsoever on the enrichment of uranium is a problem, because really we ought to know not to enrich it. What happens when you enrich it is you create a whole bunch of problems.
We'll just say Bret Weinstein makes just a bold-faced assertion here that, like, citation needed, Bret. Just
that would be paramount on any actual deity's mind. There would be wisdom about what to do about it, but it's not.
I know. And Paul over here is saying, no, the deity does have it on its mind, and actually, enrichment of uranium is how we're going to get out of this mess.
In there, and so, and maybe the last piece of that puzzle is, not only is it not in there, but we don't have time for it to be generated through the normal evolutionary process. We don't have 1,000 years to figure out what the wisdom for our new tools is. We have to figure that out in some other way. And so somehow we have to recognize there's wisdom. Some of that wisdom remains relevant and honorable. Some of it is no longer relevant. Some of it was never honorable. And we need a mechanism to add to it in a non-religious framework. And I don't know how we're going to get there.
Now, earlier in this video, or maybe later, he makes the point that you can't pick and choose from your religious tradition. You have to buy the whole thing.
Yeah, it's in here.
And it's interesting that he now basically says we have to pick and choose the wisdom. And it's funny watching him hop back and forth over that point.
Yeah, I agree.
But I do have the sense that that is the adult conversation.
Is your point that you fear whether religion can continue to provide the kind of stability it maybe once provided, because we're in these uncharted territories that Alister speaks of?
I don't say this to be dramatic, but I think we know that it can't. And that is not to say that given many Earths or somehow a mechanism for surviving for future millennia, that we wouldn't get to a new kind of wisdom that was relevant. But I think we know that our problem is too dire. And what I fear is that if science caricatures religion and does not give religion its due for being honest-to-goodness wisdom handed down through time, that religious people will rightly reject its ability to speak about more difficult issues that we face and that no ancestor has wisdom with which to help us. So my sense of urgency is about putting that battle to an end so that those of us who are ready to confront the problems of the 21st century can do it. And that's going to involve some things. There are ethical principles that we know are, if not timeless, close enough to it that we should treat them that way. And then there are other places where we're going to have to avail ourselves of new tools and not, I guess what I'm really getting at is we are going to have to violate the sacred in order to do the job that we need to do. And that means that religious people who can see that problem are going to have to bring their communities along.
Yeah, I think this is where, like and even in your response video, you brought up eugenics. I think, we have to have these conversations without immediately going to the eugenics thing, because that is kind of a buzzword that just like breaks fear into people's hearts. So,
well, in China and India, they have the technology to, and with an ultrasound, you can check the sex of your unborn child. And because so many girl babies have been aborted, it skewed the male to female population of these countries.
Right.
This is part of our capacity. I think he makes some important points here. Again, he talked about basically some wisdom that we've had forever. I never talked about the source of that wisdom. But again, I like his point that I don't want to see that it is not a fair comparison to say there's science and there's religion. Religious people use sciences all the time, and scientism is its own religion at times. And so you've got the definition of religion that's going on there. But I like a bunch of the points that he makes, and
I do see a lot of religious people attacking materialism and attacking science. I even go into that in my talk with Justin. So I mean, I understand where he's coming from. And one of my missions is kind of to figure out why that is. I guess my intuition tells me that it's a threat to their worldview. And I'm trying to figure out a workaround on that. Like, why is it such a threat? Why is science, why is materialism such a threat? I guess because it's saying that there's nothing, there is no God, and that's just destabilizing.
I don't think that's at all what's happening. Most American Christians are highly materialistic, and I don't mean they're highly avaricious in terms of their acquisition, although many of them are that too. But when you look at how, and preachers have been making this point forever in America, if you look at how many people who say that they're Christians and say that they're not Christians live, there's not a lot of difference between them.
Yes, I agree.
What might that suggest about that? I'd assert that Christians are not they're not quite what they think they are, but neither are the atheists in many ways. There's a tremendous amount of overlap. Otherwise, these communities wouldn't be able to live together or talk together or come to agreement together. And I think part of the difficulty that we've had is that on the political forefront, a lot has been made of the fact that certain segments of the American Christian community, many of whom don't go to church, have been portrayed, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly, as a particular political group. And the truth is, I often use the example of the African American population, which is the most church going ethnic group in America today. They're the most Christian segment of the population today, and they overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party. Yeah. And so this idea that Christians are Republicans and Democrats are what? It just doesn't really hold water if you look at the broader picture.
Yeah. Interesting.
And even Justin Brierley did a show with Richard Dawkins where they had a Christian and a Jewish scholar and Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins was just happy as pie to get along with the Christian and the Jew, because he said, it's not you Christians that I have a problem with. It's those certain groups of Christians that don't want there to be studying of science and biology and evolution in public school. So basically what Richard Dawkins said on this podcast that you can look up is, I don't really care what people believe, just don't monkey with public education.
Mm-hmm. I agree to some extent, even though I don't really. I think Richard Dawkins is wrong in so many areas.
Reason that we hold things sacred, but at this moment, we actually can't afford it.
Give us some concrete.
Just a quick point on this sacred business. This is actually, if you listen to John Vervaeke, this there are a lot of people who are right now talking about we need a replacement for what religion has done in the community today. And this question of what is sacred is a really big topic. And I would assert that Bret has ideas of the sacred implicit in his morality. We all do. That's the definition of what is sacred.
Individual freedom is probably one of them.
Yep. And respect for human life. And I would assert that all these things are, to one degree or another products of the Christian influence in society.
Yeah, me too.
Examples, because I think I understand what you're saying, but what might be one of those sacred areas where religious people are going to have to learn to let go for the sake of the future?
Well, we have a problem, which is that interwoven into, I believe, every one of these religious texts is a plan for competing against other populations. And if we continue to compete population against population, we will destroy ourselves. What we have to do is figure out how we can stand that competition down and replace it with some sort of agreement on how we are to interact with each other, which in some cases will be easier than others. It will be.
Now, I don't understand how Christianity hasn't stood that down already with turn the other cheek. Like, it just, that's what I don't understand. Like, this is why I think Christianity has an advantage over Islam. I don't know if Islam has a comparative ethos for turn the other cheek, but turn the other cheek is standing that competition down.
I think part of it, this gets a little, I'll try not to say too much. If you read the New Testament and you read the Gospels, everyone expects Jesus to act like Muhammad, and that he's going to pull together a group of men, arm them with swords, get the Romans out of the Holy Land, and just keep conquering from there. Mm-hmm. Jesus doesn't do that.
So he doesn't take over by force. It's not a dominance hierarchy. It's a prestige hierarchy.
Yeah, and it's a weird inverted prestige hierarchy because he goes to his disciples and they're having dinner and there's a kid standing in the corner. And Jesus says, if you want to be greatest in my kingdom, you have to be like that kid. And everyone's like, what? The kid's in the room to move the to bring in extra food and swap out their dirty dishes and stuff. Jesus says, the greatest in my kingdom is the servant of all. This actually is put into our political language. You know, the president is supposed to be the public servant. That's deeply within our language. And Christianity has that in it. But in all fairness, Christians have been really bad at it because, and this is another point I make with Bret, because Bret, you know, when we're well fed, when things are cool, it's easy to be friends with someone else. When they're threatening your livelihood, it's really hard not to hit back, and it's really hard not to do a preemptive strike. Yeah. And Christians have always struggled with that.
Easier to have that conversation with Buddhism than it will to have that conversation between Christendom and Islam, for example. But nonetheless, we all have to find our way.
I know. I was waiting.
Depends
I was like,
the Buddhism. I mean, because right now in India, Buddhists, I mean, it was just Buddhists who were persecuting Muslims in Myanmar. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, there's a long tradition of this. But again, I would say the real danger is probably between nation states, not so much simply proxies of religious traditions. There are a few of them out there like Iran, but not many.
I couldn't help but laugh when you talked about the violence in Buddhism, and I don't want people to think I'm laughing at the violence. It's funny to me that any person can be pushed to that point, and a lot of times people don't respect that. And I mean, this is one of Jordan Peterson's messages, is that you have to realize that it's very easy to think that none of us would be the prison guard, but there were the prison guards, and that
they were Christians. They went to church.
Yes. So when things turn sour, and this is what Bret is warning about. I mean, it's where people turn to religion for strength. So
there, in the case of Islam in particular, we have an obstacle, which is that they are forbidden. There can be no new prophets. Well, without new prophets, how do you update the code about how you incorporate?
This is so bad because we've already talked about how you update the code. The same way the Supreme Court is constantly updating the code. It's called interpretation. You have a new guy, a new charismatic guy that comes forward and says, "Hey, I think we've been reading this slavery thing wrong for a while."
John Calvin in Geneva basically said, you know, the biblical prohibitions against usury, which is borrowing money with interest, is only about subsistence. You can loan money with interest if you're doing it for capital, and capitalism was born. And a lot of Christians today read that Bible, they read these verses that strictly prohibit usury, and they don't read them at all. And another place in this video, Bret says something really important, which he says, in some ways, and I think he's right with this, the Bible is sort of like the genetics, but there's the epigenetics that turn on and off the code underneath. Religious traditions do that all the time.
Yes, you're part of that. You are part of that, Paul. Yeah. I'm assuming you interpret text all the time for your congregation.
Every week. You can watch me on YouTube.
This is great because I don't actually have to go to church, but I can still go, I think you got that wrong. I can still complain about it.
That's right. Right in the comment section. Most of my complaints in my comments are from Christians who say I get it wrong.
That's funny.
Wisdom, that particular, what I would say is virus protection, that thing which protects the tradition from being corrupted, is now going to be an obstacle to it progressing into the 21st century. Somebody has to navigate that, and I don't know how we find them.
You do seem to believe, Bret, that there is an oughtness about how we should behave, this idea that there is a fundamental rightness about the way humans treat each other and the common purposes we should have. Some might say, well, there's the faith, if you like. That's the religious impulse again. There is something beyond just the material world. There is actually something that undergirds it. I mean, what would you say to that idea?
I would say that the problem is that when you study evolution, you respect the products that it produces, but you also come to understand that the universe is an immoral or an amoral place, and that there's no justice in nature. Humans have invented.
What do you say about that and your objective morality? He basically says the universe is amoral.
Yeah, I think he's wrong. I honestly think he's wrong, and I think Jordan Peterson's right. And I want to see that conversation that he said in the very beginning of this. I argue this with Jordan Peterson, and like we both believe in the Jordan Peterson God. Jordan Peterson's God is a very materialistic God, and it's about. You probably haven't read this book, but it's by Robert Wright, and I'm gonna mess it up, but it's about how. It's Zero, I think, is in the title. I shouldn't have brought it up because I don't remember the title of the book, but it's about how we progress towards more and more cooperation, and that more and more things become like zero-sum games become extinct over time because there's losers, and you're just better off in an environment where things are win-win situations. So those win-win situations accumulate over time. Capitalism is one of them that you've pointed out, and this is Jordan Peterson's message, that this is God in the machine, us working towards a better and better society through these win-win situations that build up over time. So this is where I completely disagree with Bret, and I wish Bret and Peterson would do a talk on this kind of subject. So what do you have to say?
So let's keep playing.
To justice, and that it is precious and it is easily destroyed. And the problem is, to the extent that these traditions, which contain ethics within them, are products of evolution, they are potentially very valuable, but that ability to cooperate, which is really...
Just said humans have invented justice, and he just said they're products of evolution.
Yeah.
And it's like, Come on, Bret.
What those
there's
ethical-
also, and this is a little inside baseball here, but it's interesting. So on Twitter, there is this huge debate going on between all of the prominent evolutionary biologists. Like Jerry Coyne is a huge anti-theist. He's involved. I don't know if Dawkins is involved yet. David Sloan Wilson, who I have talked about coming on the show before, he's involved in it. They're trying to set up a talk between David Sloan Wilson and Bret Weinstein because Stephen Pinker is involved in this debate, and they're arguing over group selection. And the Weinstein doesn't accept group selection, but the argument that he's laying out here is a group selection argument. He's saying that groups of individuals compete against other groups, and that those groups sometimes annihilate one another. He's basically saying religious traditions bind people into these groups compete against other groups, and sometimes one of those comes out on top and one doesn't. So I'm curious what his argument is.
Well, I think it's interesting. I often make the point that if you look back in history, when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, everyone assumed that the Hebrews' religion would simply be assimilated into Babylonia. But you can go down the street and find Jewish synagogues and Christian churches all over the place. Not one temple to Marduk. Someone won.
Yes. Maybe we should switch over to super chats because I don't want to shirk.
I feel bad we didn't get to the questions last time. So
yeah, exactly. So let's take a look here, see if I can get them. Jordan Mariki. Sorry if I'm getting your name totally terribly. If I'm slaughtering your name here, but for $2 New Zealand dollars, all he says is awesome. Thank you so much. Joseph Chan Goldstein for $2 says, is JP a fraud after ending up in rehab? I know you want to answer that one.
He's not a fraud.
Yeah,
his doctor was concerned. No, his doctor was concerned for his health because of the horrible. I mean, we watched him.
Yeah.
He couldn't do a talk without bursting into tears. He was obviously upset. The doctor wanted him to try a psych med that is very addictive. And so how do you get off it safely? You go to a rehab facility. No shame in that.
I do thank you for the super chat though. John Buck for $5 says 30 minutes in and only 30 seconds through. Looks like I got here just in time. Thank you, John Buck, for pointing that out. John Buck for another $2 says, Paul's very good at colonizing other people's channels. Paul, is this a hostile takeover? Are you taking over my channel?
No, you will welcome me as your benevolent overlord.
He uses the God thing on me, and I'm an atheist, but still, I'm like, am I going to get struck by lightning here? I don't know. I don't feel right about this. Okay, Paul. Yes. What time next week would you like to do the live stream? Jordan Mareki for another $5 says, religion is a science. Religion is a science because they experiment with models of living over long periods of time, and I do agree somewhat with that. What's your opinion, Paul?
I think in fact religious traditions do this all the time, and they keep records and they compare and they say, is God going to bless this? And they look at empirical evidence for the blessing. Happens all the time.
Yeah, it is a very intuitive process, and for me as a materialist, it's difficult for me to say that the intuitive process does not deliver better results. Like, you may not necessarily know what's going on consciously, but if you're actually delivering better results, I mean, our moral intuitions can be wrong, though. We should be conscious of that, obviously.
Oh,
so
yeah.
We want to test them, but you're basically making the argument that the intuitions are where things start, and then kind of the community tests them out in an empirical way. Like if we have, if some idea raises a lot of dissent, and this is actually what happened with prohibition, for instance. Like we had the moral intuition that there's this problem where men are beating their wives a little bit too much, and it seems to be related to alcohol. If we can eliminate that, maybe we can eliminate the problem. And it actually created a whole host of problems that were even worse. So,
but at the end of it, consumption rates in America was drastically lower after Prohibition. So
Right.
even though the application itself obviously was a failure, the overall process, which again gets into the, you measure things, we are so quick to judgment. Human societies live for long periods of time. We really have to stretch out the time that we use to evaluate things.
Yeah, very, very important. So I guess we'll go like another 7 minutes, and we'll watch a little more of the video.
Okay.
Principles are about is for a purpose. Cooperate to compete. Now, if we keep playing that game, it will end very soon. So how do we abstract that idea that we can cooperate and come to a new agreement about how to leave essentially an equilibrium, a sustainable human population in which, and this would be my highest ethical principle, how can we give the maximum number of humans the experience of living on a beautiful planet as possible? It is not going to...
Okay. Now, first of all, competition, I think we compete to cooperate. Competition is not a bad thing as long as it's within bounds. I think
Right.
that's a far better point.
Rules, yes.
Yes,
We love
yes.
basketball. We love football. We don't want to get rid of that stuff.
No.
That's our bread and butter.
And religious communities are always arguing, and people look at that and say, oh, it's terrible how these religious people argue. They're working stuff out. And if they can learn to argue productively, talk to any marriage counselor. A marriage counselor will tell you in a healthy marriage, there's argument, but the argumentation is productive because two people are trying to figure out together through competition the way forward.
Yes.
And I think one metaphor for that is Central Soviet planning versus a market system. Now, markets are rough, but productive potentially, especially given an environment of change. They can be a lot smarter than somebody in the Politburo.
Well, we have to balance dynamism versus decency. I think that's the big trade-off there. We want a dynamic economy, and those can be rough, but we want a measure of decency. We don't want people screwing people over for the last dollar. So that's an important aspect of it.
It's going to involve packing the largest number of people on the planet at once. It's going to involve somehow backing away from what we call carrying capacity and leaving a population that cannot destroy as it continues to live on the earth. And in that way, humanity could become indefinite inhabitants. So how do we get from...
Now I think, and you and I have talked about this already, it's my bone to pick with this argument is he's sneaking in what should be. And I agree with him. I think we should have, I think more humans are better than fewer humans. I think people living in a sustainable way is better than people living in an unsustainable way. But when he talks this way, it almost sounds like, especially with the thing about competition, it almost sounds like central planning. And the truth is, I think human life is very messy and people get unhappy, and necessity is the mother of invention. And so this whole section of the conversation sounds somewhere between the Matrix and the Politburo. And
it does have that. It does have that tone to it. I gave you a hard time because you said in a video something about we need to back off the population or have a lower population. He doesn't really say that. He says he's basically making the argument that populations in the wild tend to exhaust their resources and crash. That seems to be a normal thing. And nobody knows what the carrying capacity of the world is because we keep figuring out ways to make more with less. So a lot of people have said that there is a natural 10 billion human limit that they think we will reach because as people gain more material wealth, they have less children. So there are a lot of people in the world having a lot of children now, but those are poor people. and those poor people will become rich people in a generation, and the people who are older will die off, and we will settle out at a sustainable population of about 10 billion. So if things keep going the way that they are, I don't see overpopulation being a problem. A lot of people use overpopulation as a way to scare you to the polls, so you'll vote for whoever is saying, I'm going to change things, I'm going to make things sustainable for us. You're not going to have to worry about it. But I don't necessarily think it's a big problem in our future. So
I'd highly recommend a very interesting book called The Alchemy of Air. Mm-hmm. And it's about the fixation of nitrogen. At the beginning of the 20th century, many people feared that in terms of organic food production, if we all farmed like the most efficient Chinese water terraces, the earth could perhaps sustain 3.5 to 4 billion people. That was incredibly extended by the fixation of nitrogen, which allowed both chemical fertilizers, which allowed Germany to feed its people, and munitions. And so Bret talks about he talks about the refinement of uranium. Well, 100 years ago, it was the fixation of nitrogen. And same trade-off, we have more food, we also have more bombs.
Yeah. Well, this, I don't think we should go any further. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope you guys get a lot out of it. We can obviously do this again if you're interested. I do have the power to resist Paul's mind mojo on me, but he is such a good conversation partner because he knows a lot of things that I don't necessarily know, and I feel like I can give some insight that he doesn't necessarily know. So that's what it's all about. That's a really good combo. So let us know in the comments below your thoughts, obviously, on this discussion. If you have any ideas for future stuff, you can go ahead and throw them in there. You want to say anything before we sign off, Paul?
Well, Adam will be a Christian in 2 years, and then we'll just be able to sing Kumbaya together. So there we have it.
Maybe we should hammer that out for a couple minutes, because my audience is under the impression that I'm gonna turncoat on my atheist brethren, and I don't necessarily like this, because I rank high in loyalty. I don't betray my tribe. So I don't necessarily know if I like this kind of encouragement. And who are you? Why are you guys encouraging this disloyalty? What is up with that? Seriously, am I in any way encouraging you guys to become atheists, to become unloyal to your Christian brethren? Am I doing any of that, Paul?
They're all praying for you, Adam, which of course doesn't scare you, but maybe should.
Well, I understand, and I do. First of all, I want to thank you. I want to thank the Christian. Half my audience is Christian. I want to thank you for praying for me, because I know in your worldview, you picture me being, being in a tough let's just say a tough situation upon my death. Don't worry about me, guys. I'm gonna live forever. Are you kidding me? I'm a future robot. I got laser eyes lined up. It ain't over yet. It ain't over yet. I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thank you so much for the super chats, and we will see you in the next video.